Welcome to the debate. Usually, when we look out at the world, we just assume we are looking through a perfectly clear glass window. We think we're taking in reality exactly as it is, objective, fixed, and totally undeniable.
Right. It feels like we are just passive observers, like we're simply downloading the facts of our environment into our brains without altering them at all.
Exactly. But then you realize that the glass isn't a window at all. It's a lens. And sitting right behind it is a movie projector, essentially playing a film that was shot entirely inside your own head.
Yeah, we constantly superimpose our internal states onto external reality, which is, the absolute definition of the projection trap.
External environment. And what's fascinating is that this trap stretches from the most intimate dynamics of our romantic relationships all the way up to corporate forecasting.
And even the structural architecture of artificial intelligence. The phenomenon itself is undeniable. We all do it.
We do, but our central disagreement today is about the underlying mechanism that actually drives it. So is this projection trap fundamentally a cognitive processing error?
Right, meaning is it just a mechanical forecasting bias? Something driven by our brain's simple inability to differentiate our current physical or mental state from future environments?
Or is it, as I will argue, primarily a psychodynamic defense mechanism, one designed to protect a fragile ego from just unbearable truths? To put it simply, I argue that projection is fundamentally an emotional shield protecting the self.
And I argue that it is a mechanical and systemic processing flaw, plain and simple.
Let's lay out our positions so we can really dig into this. If we draw on the foundational work of Sigmund Freud, which was later expanded by the psychoanalyst Otto Fenichel, the psychodynamic perspective defines projection as a primitive defense mechanism.
And by primitive, you mean it operates almost reflexively?
Exactly. It happens when the ego splits off unacceptable internal impulses, things we simply cannot bear to admit about ourselves, and it places them onto external targets. It's a kind of psychological alchemy, really.
Meaning it transforms the feeling into something else entirely.
Yes. Imagine you have a feeling or an impulse that is so fundamentally unacceptable to who you think you are that acknowledging it would shatter your self-image. Your brain converts the intolerable, anxiety-inducing internal reality of, say, I hate them, into the much more psychologically manageable external threat of, they hate me.
Right. It externalizes the threat so you don't have to take responsibility for the original feeling.
Precisely. Look at how this manifests in high-conflict environments, like a bitter divorce. You often see the classic archetype of the accuser. One spouse projects their own highly controlling impulses during the settlement negotiations onto their partner.
So they complain about the very thing they're doing.
Yes, they vehemently accuse the partner of the exact control and manipulation they themselves are actively demonstrating in the room. Or take the victim, who claims constant emotional manipulation by their ex, yet extensively employs guilt trips to achieve their own ends.
And you're saying this isn't just a cognitive blind spot?
No, it isn't a simple cognitive glitch or a math error in the brain. This is rooted in profound anxiety, guilt, and a desperate unconscious need to protect our core stability, what psychologists call the ego self-access. It is a profound emotional survival tactic.
Well, I come at it from a very different way. While the psychoanalytic narrative is incredibly compelling and, Freud always makes for a good story, over-psychologizing projection completely misses the broader, mechanical reality of how our brains actually process data.
Okay, how so?
When we look at the research from behavioral economics, specifically George Lowenstein's work, we see that this is fundamentally a projection bias. It is what we call a false consensus effect.
So you're saying we just assume everyone automatically agrees with us?
Not just agrees with us, but actually feels exactly what we feel in a given moment. We simply overweight our current physiological or emotional state when we are trying to predict the future or evaluate others. Our brains use our current state as a physical anchor.
and we just can't move past that anchor?
Exactly. We fail to adjust away from it. It is a universal flaw in how we process spatial and temporal data. It's really that simple.
Give me an example of what that looks like in daily life, outside of a lab.
Think about the classic mundane examples we've all experienced. You go to the grocery store when you're starving and you buy an absurd amount of junk food. You completely fail to predict that your future self, who, just ate dinner an hour later, won't want any of those snacks.
Oh, I have definitely done that.
We all have. Your brain couldn't simulate the state of being full because the state of being hungry was just too loud. Or look at Michael Conlin's fascinating study on catalog orders. He showed that people are highly likely to return a winter coat they ordered online if the weather on the day of the return happens to be 30 degrees warmer than the day they bought it.
Wait, seriously? So the physical temperature outside changes their perception of the coat's value?
Exactly. There is no hidden childhood trauma driving the return of a winter coat. It is simply an empathy gap. We cannot put ourselves in the state of our future selves or in the state of other people because we are too securely anchored to our present data inputs.
The brain just takes a shortcut.
Yeah, it assumes tomorrow will feel exactly like today.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently when we move from returning winter coats to actual human relationships. Let's look at the interpersonal dynamics, specifically the phenomenon of walking on eggshells in a romantic partnership.
You mean the feeling of constantly monitoring the other person's mood?
Yes. When an individual is walking on eggshells, they are intensely monitoring their partner, terrified that any wrong word will cause an explosion, or worse, lead to sudden abandonment. But very often, in these clinical cases, the partner is entirely safe.
They aren't volatile at all.
Right. What's actually happening is the individual is projecting their own unresolved childhood wounds onto their current partner. They are essentially fighting old battles with parental figures who aren't even in the room.
They superimpose the past onto the present.
Yes, they superimpose the terrifying, unpredictable parent onto the face of the safe spouse. That is a profound emotional defense mechanism designed to anticipate and survive trauma. It is not a mere data processing error.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are assuming that every interpersonal miscalibration, every time we misread someone, requires a traumatic origin story. But look at Nali Benavi's study out of Tel Aviv University on stress mindsets.
Okay, what did she find?
She looked at how people fundamentally view stress in the workplace. Some people view stress as entirely debilitating. The stress is distressing mindset. But others view it as an exhilarating catalyst. The stress is enhancing mindset.
Right, the adrenaline junkies of the corporate world, the people who thrive on a looming deadline.
Exactly. They get a hit of dopamine from the pressure. Now, when a manager holds that stress is enhancing mindset, Benavi found that they mechanically project that exact mindset onto their burnt-out employees.
So they think the employees are enjoying the pressure too?
Yes. Because the manager feels energized and hyper-focused by pressure in their current state, they suffer from a cognitive empathy gap. They literally cannot perceive the actual degree of their employees' physical and emotional exhaustion. So they dismiss genuine suffering as mere complaining, and they deny them support or sick leave.
Because they assume the employee is experiencing the same adrenaline rush they are.
Precisely. This isn't about unresolved childhood trauma or projecting a volatile father figure onto an accountant. It's a failure of temporal and spatial data processing. The manager cannot separate their own internal neurochemical state from the external reality of their employee's completely different neurochemical state.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you have to ask why the manager holds so rigidly to that stress is enhancing mindset in the first place, especially in the face of evidence that their team is falling apart.
What do you mean? It's just their baseline state?
But isn't that empathy gap you're describing actually a defense mechanism in disguise? If that manager pauses to truly acknowledge the crushing burnout of their colleague, they might be forced to acknowledge their own exhaustion.
Ah, I see where you're going.
Right. Acknowledging the reality of the employee's suffering threatens the manager's own precarious coping strategy. If the employee is allowed to be exhausted, maybe the manager is secretly exhausted too. The cognitive blindness you're describing is just the symptom. The defense of the ego against total collapse is the actual cause.
But you're assuming the manager is secretly exhausted and just repressing it. The physiological data suggests they are genuinely in a hot state of high energy, and their brain is simply using that current state as an anchor to predict the state of everyone around them.
You really don't think there's a protective element there?
I think it's an algorithmic shortcut that misfires. It doesn't have to be a defense mechanism. Sometimes a glitch is just a glitch.
Well, let's see what happens when that glitch scales up. Because this blindness isn't limited to a manager and an employee. What happens when the person with that kind of emotional blindness isn't just managing an office, but leading a massive spiritual community?
You're taking it to the macro level.
Yes. In spiritual and existential contexts, we see what is called the meaning trap. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung expanded on this idea with his concept of the participation mystique.
Unpack that term for us. What exactly is the participation mystique?
It describes a state where an individual cannot clearly distinguish themselves from an external object or a person. The psychological boundaries between me and you completely blur. In spiritual communities, followers often project an ideal form onto deeply flawed leaders.
You see this in the guru-disciple dynamic all the time.
Constantly, and sometimes with catastrophic results. The followers essentially strip the leader of all human complexity, all flaws, and view them as the literal embodiment of divine enlightenment.
Like they can do no wrong?
Exactly. Think of extreme historical examples like Jim Jones and the Jonestown Massacre, or in the Western Zen community with figures like Genpo Martso Roshi. Martso leveraged this exact psychological projection to fund a luxurious lifestyle and commit severe boundary violations against his students.
And the followers just accepted it?
They surrendered their critical faculties entirely to this participation mystique. And the question is why? To defend against what psychologists call meaning anxiety, it is a defense against pure existential dread.
The dread of a random universe?
Exactly. The terrifying possibility that the universe is random, cold, and devoid of intrinsic purpose. By projecting absolute divine meaning onto a human leader, the follower's ego repairs its broken connection to the world. They feel safe because someone else is driving the car. That is the ultimate emotional shield.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered how this exact same macro-level projection destroys nations on a purely economic and operational level without a single drop of existential dread involved?
I'm intrigued. How so?
Let's look at India's 2016 demonetization policy. It is one of the greatest systemic projection failures of the modern era. Overnight, the government demonetized the 500 and 1,000 rupee notes.
Which was a massive portion of their currency, right?
Yes. It essentially wiped out 86% of the country's currency in circulation in a matter of hours.
Which is almost unimaginable for an economy of that size.
It was chaos, absolute chaos. And why did they do it? The policymakers, sitting in air-conditioned offices with high-speed internet and mobile banking apps, projected their own digital fluency onto a massive rural population.
They just assumed everyone could go digital instantly?
They assumed a rapid, frictionless adaptation to digital banking because they found digital banking frictionless. They completely ignored the fact that millions of farmers, day laborers, and small merchants relied entirely on a physical cash economy.
And they probably didn't have the infrastructure for digital banking.
They didn't even have reliable electricity, let alone smartphones.
So they assumed their environment was the universal environment.
Exactly. It was a catastrophic failure. And it wasn't driven by spiritual anxiety or a fear of a random universe. It was a mechanical failure of the forecast accuracy trap. It was a static, linear extrapolation that completely ignored the environmental reality on the ground.
They modeled the whole country on their own bubble.
Right. They modeled the future of over 1 billion people based on their own highly specific, localized, privileged data set.
You know what this reminds me of? It's like looking at a world map on a classroom wall. You know how Greenland always looks absolutely massive, sometimes even bigger than Africa?
Right, the Mercator projection.
Exactly. In cartography, there are what we call GIS map traps. Map makers are mathematically forced to distort the physical size of polar regions to fit a three-dimensional spherical globe onto a two-dimensional flat map.
And that creates the visual distortion.
Yes, that mathematical compromise is why Greenland looks the size of Africa, even though in physical reality, Africa is about 14 times larger.
It's the mathematical compromise of the projection itself.
Exactly. And I would argue that psychological projection operates the exact same way. Just as the cartographer distorts the 3D globe to fit a 2D map, those policymakers in India were actively distorting the three-dimensional, complex reality of rural poverty to fit neatly into their two-dimensional political narrative of a modernized cashless society.
So you're saying the distortion was self-serving?
Yes, the distortion serves the narrative. It protects the policymaker's ego, their legacy, and their worldview from the messy, complex reality that directly contradicts it.
Well, following that map analogy, if projection is fundamentally a mathematical compromise, a systemic processing error, like drawing a 3D globe on a 2D piece of paper, then the solution has to be structural and mechanical.
How do you mean?
You don't fix the Mercator projection by putting the mapmaker in psychoanalysis to explore their childhood, right? You fix it by changing the coordinate reference system.
Okay, fair point. Go on. How does that apply to the human or systemic level?
Let's look at the software world, which provides a perfect blueprint for how we fix this. For years, vehicle infotainment systems suffered from a literal, technical projection trap when integrating things like Apple CarPlay or Android Auto.
A technical projection trap?
Yes. Prior to Google's release of Android Automotive OS 14, projection lived at the low-level C++ hardware abstraction layer.
Hold on. Translate that for the non-engineers listening. What does that actually mean?
Think of the car's native operating system as the brain, and the Apple CarPlay projection as a blindfold. In the old system, the software essentially punched a physical hole through the car's user interface and piped the video from your phone directly to the hardware screen.
Bypassing the car's actual brain.
Yes, because it bypassed the native window manager, the car's brain was completely blind to what was on the screen.
So the car didn't know what the screen was displaying.
Right. The external projection had total unmanaged sovereignty, which is incredibly dangerous. If the car needed to show a critical low battery warning or a brake failure alert, it couldn't easily overlay that warning on top of your Google Maps navigation without causing screen flickering or outright system crashes.
It bypassed the system's awareness entirely. It was just painting over reality.
Exactly. So how did Google fix it in OS 14? They didn't put the software in therapy. They moved the projection from the low-level hardware layer up into standard Java UI containers, specifically something called Task View.
So they boxed it in?
In plain English, yes. They structurally forced the projection to exist inside a designated box within the native operating system's awareness. This allowed the car's brain to regain control, realize the projection was happening, and superimpose its own critical alerts safely.
You containerize the projection?
Yes, and we do the exact same thing in corporate finance to fix cognitive projection bias. Organizations move from static, rigid annual plans, where a CEO projects their January optimism onto the whole year, to dynamic rolling forecasts.
So updating it constantly.
Right, they force the system to update every single month based on actual emerging market drivers. You structurally containerize the bias through rules and algorithms so it can't crash the entire system.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. You can patch Android OS 14 with a software update, and you can update a financial algorithm with new accounting rules. But you cannot simply patch human consciousness.
You don't think so?
No. Moving a data projection into a UI container is a brilliant technical fix, but the human equivalent requires a radical, agonizing dismantling of the ego.
But wait, you don't think cognitive behavioral techniques act as a kind of UI container for the human mind? You notice a thought, you label it, you put it in a box.
They can help at a surface level, sure, but true liberation from the projection trap requires deep somatic awareness and awareness of the body. The body actually registers the projection before the conscious mind does.
Like physical symptoms?
Yes. It's the jaw clenching, the sudden chest tightness, the rigid posture when a colleague gives you completely neutral feedback that you suddenly interpret as a vicious attack. To escape that requires what the Chan Buddhist patriarch Lin Chi metaphorically called, kill the Buddha.
Ah, the famous koan. If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him.
Yes. And what that actually means is severing your attachment to the externalized, idealized projection. You have to realize that the divine qualities you are projecting onto a guru or the absolute malice you are projecting onto your ex-spouse are actually disowned parts of yourself.
And taking them back is hard?
It's excruciating. Reclaiming those parts is not a software update. It is a brutal, emotionally demanding process of self-honesty that goes far beyond moving data from C++ to Java. You literally have to mourn the loss of the illusion that protected you.
It is a difficult process, certainly, and I appreciate the depth of that psychological framework. But to summarize where I stand after this exchange, I maintain that whether we are talking about human beings in a grocery store, corporate supply chains in India, or even AI systems falling into recursive feedback loops, projection is fundamentally a foundational cognitive and systemic bias.
A universal error, essentially.
Yes, it is a universal processing error, where the agent, be it a human brain or a machine, fails to separate its internal, localized state from the external, objective reality. By treating it as a mechanical error rather than a moral or emotional failing, we can build dynamic frameworks like rolling forecasts and structural software guardrails to mitigate the damage.
And to summarize my position, while the systemic manifestations you've pointed out are undeniable and fascinating, projection remains at its core the ego's ultimate survival tool. It is an emotional shield against meaninglessness, guilt, and existential anxiety.
So it's protective, not just broken?
Exactly. To dismantle it requires more than structural adjustments or new algorithms. It requires a courageous willingness to label our own emotions, confront our own shadows, and engage in the very painful work of psychological differentiation.
Yet, despite our different approaches to the root cause today, I think we've reached a powerful point of convergence. Whether you view projection as an emotional shield protecting a fragile ego, or as a mechanical mirror reflecting a data processing error, the trap itself is exactly the same.
It really is. It is a fundamental failure of system-environment differentiation. We mistake our internal model for objective reality, and we act on that model as if it were the absolute truth.
And the only way out, regardless of the mechanism, is to cultivate the capacity to step back, to get to the balcony view, as they say in leadership coaching, and observe the dance playing out on the floor rather than just blindly participating in it.
There is so much more to explore in this material, but we will leave it there for today. We encourage you to take that balcony view this week. Ask yourself, what internal movies are you currently superimposing onto the people and situations in your life?
It's a tough question to ask.
It is. But remember, that clear glass window you think you're looking through might just be a lens, and the projector is always running. Thank you for joining us.